A constitution was written that came to be regarded as American Holy Writ. Its central purpose were to defend private property and suppress mass democracy. It has fulfilled both those mandates beyond the wildest dreams of its creators. Once the existing oligarchy was secure in law and native people largely exterminated, the ruling class increased its wealth and power fantastically in the 19th century, using the government as its enabler, exploiting to the limit the device of chartered corporations. With its phenomenal money power, the financial elite began to use the military to expand its sway beyond the continent. Regions, territories, islands, and whole countries were annexed, invaded, and possessed outright. Their peoples crushed, suppressed, and ruled. Because ordinary Americans, like any people, need to believe that whatever the ruling elite undertakes in their nation's name must be essentially benevolent, noble in purpose, and justified in fact. The myth had to be radically modified for imperial expansion. The foundational story was that Americans had come to a howling wilderness teeming with godless savages, and through invincible strength of character and purity of purpose, had tamed the land and honorably earned the right to possess their bountiful home. In the extraterritorial expansion, that version was polished to justify and ennoble imperialism. The new corollary was that America could not ignore colonialist brutality, but was obliged by the manifest destiny that led us to civilize our own continent to carry our mission into barbaric darkness wherever tyranny created abuse and suffering. A national myth that absolutely binds loyalty to the people to its government must be a subtle and powerful elixir that elevates and aggrandizes that people's self-regard. National policy will then appear to be an extension of its superior citizenry until it will, and the basis for justified arrogance toward the lesser world. The simple, powerful truth of America's altruistic and heroic benevolence, shaped and maintained by the financial and political power elite, infused Americans with a deep and outrageously hubristic sense of racial superiority that, mobilized behind various imperial enterprises, has given all such adventures the character of a quasi-religious crusade. In this way, insatiable imperialism acquires the apparent moral perfection of syllogism. With World War II, the world was reconfigured. American capitalism emerged supreme from the horror that had virtually wrecked its capitalist partners. The Soviet Union, though having absorbed by far the greatest devastation from Nazi Germany, had astonishingly risen above its ruin to become the leading challenger to America as a world power. This challenge was not competitive, it was systemic. Soviet communism was a direct threat to American hegemony in that it categorically refuted the philosophical basis of predatory capitalism. Grounded in Marx and Lenin, it attacked capitalism's inherent evils, monstrous inequities, and flagrant injustices that, exacerbated by speculation, exploitation, and fraud, would destroy it. And it promoted world revolution to that end. The face-off of giants in the Cold War necessitated further refinement of the American myth. Now, instead of simply intervening in situations where despotism or tyranny required America to forcefully implant our just and ethical democracy, America had to become the shield and bulwark of the sacred capitalist system in which free enterprise was magically and increasingly identified with democracy and equally to be defended. This version prevailed through many surrogate confrontations around the globe in the era of mutually assured destruction and survived even the debacle of Vietnam, lasting until the collapse of the Soviet Union as the propaganda stream became ever more intense and pervasive. On radio and television, Americans were subjected to an unrelenting barrage of hyper-patriotism in which American moral superiority was a given, and America's self-touted courage, generosity, and decency were its unchallengeable proofs. The implosion of the Soviet Union left America, in its own terminology, the sole superpower in a unipolar world. This, however, did not result in diminution of the myth. The practical effect of having no doomsday enemy, China couldn't plausibly be cast in that role then, was to supercharge it by increasing its element of pure hubristic ego. America was no longer just called upon to defend the free world from monstrous heresy. It was now, by virtue of its universally acknowledged beatific exceptionalism, required required to oversee and police it in the interest and for the benefit of lesser nations. Power corrupts, said Lord Mahan, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Actually, Mahan did not originate that. Niccolo Machiavelli did, over 500 years ago. When the only rival and counterweight to American power disintegrated, there was a sense within the American power elite that the opportunity existed for the first time in history for one country to absolutely dominate and effectively control the entire world. This consensus was expressed in a policy statement composed by a cadre of major right-wing political players representing massive corporate capitalist interests called the Project for a New American Century. This triumphalist manifesto laid out a plan for absolute American access and control of essential resources and raw materials worldwide, to be guaranteed by the military, which would enforce full-spectrum dominance. The American myth, which had seemed to have lost momentum, and its animating principle in the totally unexpected so-called Cold War victory, was now re-energized with a less defensive and reactive essence, given the glowing radiance and patina of true and for the first time self-professed and articulated imperial mission. The attack on the towers, an unimaginable provocation, was the trigger mechanism for the explosive launch of the effort to impose that imperial model and practice on the world. It has been without question the most spectacular failure in the history of American misadventure. After a decade marked by the waste of trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of American lives, the stunning bankruptcy of our internally burglarized nation, and a consequent recession more fundamentally damaging than the Great One, Imperial America has nothing to show for the botched folly of its arrogant overreach but unequivocal disasters in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, with no end of madness in sight. An impartial observer would have to say that the hypnotic hold of the American myth on the loyalty of the people has led only to disgrace and disaster, and set a direct course to inevitable imperial decline and ruin. That would be inarguable. On any rational basis, but it entirely mistakes the motive for and the purpose of the myth. The American myth was never intended to serve the interests either of our country or of our people. It was created solely to buttress, shield, and exalt the ruling financial class. It has done that with astonishing and unbroken success that staggers their imagination from our earliest days. The massive looting of Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan war funding to enrich the corporate tyranny, for that is what it has become, is on a unique scale of its own, without anything remotely comparable to its flagrant obscenity in the whole long history of war. Neither the Pentagon nor any branch of the U.S. government can give any accounting whatever of the many billions of tax-generated dollars that have vanished, evaporated. There is no doubt but that beyond the outrageously inflated no-bid contracts handed to giant corporate favorites such as Halliburton, Dick Cheney's old company, with their preposterous guaranteed profits, much of the money was simply stolen in bulk by, through, or in spite of the military, and distributed among thieves and accomplices, some of it on huge pallets, for convenience, presumably. While this wholesale robbery was going on under the oversight of the military abroad, the corporate tyranny had evolved a whole set of impenetrably complex devices for the generation of money without any economically productive source or result at home. The sole driving force and purpose of capitalism is the realization of profit. According to that calculus, reducing production costs increases profit margin. This leads to the obvious conclusion that as production costs near zero, profit is maximized. There is no provision for social good in capitalist theory. Corporations created to optimize business opportunity through efficient specialization were originally required to operate for public benefit, but that provision was quickly finessed and forgotten. American law courts have always favored corporate concentrations of wealth since they, like Congress, exist to serve the moneyed interests. The American myth was created to provide cover for the financial oligarchy to exploit the country and the citizenry, and the judiciary has consistently cooperated in ruling for corporations against the people. Indeed, without ever considering the question in law, the Supreme Court long ago endowed corporations with personhood. That is with all rights of human beings under our Constitution. That was the Slaughterhouse Meat Company, Corporation rather, in New Orleans, in a case in 1872, was when personhood, corporate citizenship was granted to corporations. And that was done under the 14th Amendment, whose target was the freedmen, the newly freed slaves. Somehow it got distorted into personhood for corporations. The way this travesty occurred, the slipshod byproduct of an obliquely related case, showed that the court preferred to incorporate this perversion of the plain intent of the 14th Amendment as an unexamined assumption rather than risk an eventual test which could unquestionably have created violent public outrage. Given the collusion of Congress and the courts in securing legal invulnerability for the corporate tyranny and the principle that the only duty of corporations is maximization of profit, it was not surprising that mega banks, huge brokerage houses, giant insurance conglomerates, gilded hedge funds, and accredited agencies pretending to certify their work all engage in massive and systemic fraud and deception just for that purpose. The result was a crash of '08, the recession, and the stunning and unprecedented rescue and bailout of the biggest banks, investment houses, and insurance and credit conglomerates with taxpayer dollars. So much for the hallowed invisible hand of the free market. The last decades have seen two relegated megatrends in American geopolitical mechanics, both with dire effects on the power of the American myth. First, what belief the world at large had in it has been shattered by a catastrophic series of imbecile and irretrievably military failures and disasters, which has caused erosion of its efficacy at home. Second, in response to this, the state has made increasingly crude efforts to boost the myth's waning power by the imposition of totalitarian methods of surveillance, intimidation, and coercion on the American people to a degree unprecedented in scope and scale. The whole clanking medieval apparatus of Homeland Security that has sprouted like an enormous poison fungus since 9/11 with its brutal police state mindset, the odious Patriots Act with its flagrant subversions of the Bill of Rights, the endless fantasy-based terror peddling of the prostitute corporate media with its clowns and harpies churning irrational fear and anger in the uninformed. All this grim repressive endeavor is a concerted attempt to distract Americans from real causes of their injury, abuse, and oppression. And yet, even with the American myth now totally and irreparably blown full of holes and exposed demonstrably for the tissue of lies, deceptions, and frauds that it has always been, it somehow keeps its phenomenal hold on the great mass of the American people. The tragic reality is that, for the majority, their own identities have been so deeply and thoroughly infused with the myth that to disbelieve it is to disbelieve in themselves. Could the brainwashing be more profound or more pervasive? So the American myth is dead, and yet it lives on in its deadness, horribly making our crapshot economy, our bankrupt debtor's prison of a society, our ghost dance charade of kabuki democracy, while typhoons of impending social, economic, and ecological disaster build their enormous, lightning-charged thunderheads above the dark future before us. And what is it that the dead myth still imperfectly obscures for Americans? What is outside and beyond the opaque wall of faltering, failing dishonesty and deception? What is the horror that the shoddy, tattered myth has so long and so effectively concealed? It is the world that has suffered unrelieved exploitation by the violence of our imperialist mania. It is the many wrecked and pillaged economies financially looted by our imposed predatory capitalist austerity regimes. It is the teeming hundreds of millions of starved, deprived, and dying children sacrificed to Wall Street commodities gaming. It is the multitudes of humble, innocent, ignorant people barely surviving in absolutist and dictatorial regimes propped up in their barbaric cruelty by our military, while our banks siphon off the profits left after arming their brutal police and armies and bribing their ruling kings, sheikhs, or generals. It is the millions of dead and maimed and the raped populations of simple tribal people